Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Lunch and Learns. I'm so excited that we're back. Unfortunately, we are going to be away again. I'm going to monitor for Torreya pretty soon, the next week and the week after. But the week after that, I am going to be presenting a topic. I'm going to be presenting Between Two Balms on Dicerandra, on our work to preserve and conserve Dicerandra modesta and Dicerandra cornatissima, which we'll be learning more from Andre today. So without further ado, here is Dr. Naranjo.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me again today. Honored to be talking to the Florida Native Plant Society, which was a very big part of helping to fund my dissertation work, and a lot of the research that you see here today is thanks to organizations like the Florida Native Plant Society that were very generous with their awards and contributions to grad students, and are really doing awesome stuff, helping us really tease apart natural history of a whole bunch of different groups and plants that are endemic to Florida. And let me start off. I'll share my screen, correct? Yeah. All right. Go into it. So I heard that before we even got started, we had our first question with regards to Dicerandra and the kind of like the etymology behind the three different parts within the name. And yes, di does refer to two. Ser refers to seros, which in Greek means horn, and andra is a Greek root meaning referring to andros, which means man. So Dicerandra literally means two-horned man. Funny name, obviously. And it refers to the fact that all members of this genus have two-horned anthers. And if you're not familiar with anthers, anthers are the male portion of the flower. So it's a very descriptive name. We love descriptive names in evolutionary biology and taxonomy because they help give us an information as to what the plant or the species might look like. So I'm really excited to be able to share some of my dissertation results with you all. And I hope that after this, you'll have a newfound appreciation for this incredibly charismatic genus of plants that are endemic to a biodiversity hotspot. So starting off, to talk about that biodiversity hotspot, it's necessary to obviously give proper context for where these plants occur. So the North American coastal plain was first recognized as a biodiversity hotspot in 2015 by Reed Noss at UCF. Despite its relatively young age as a biodiversity hotspot, approximately only 4 million years old, it's home to over 1,800 endemic vascular plant species. It's estimated that over 70% of the original pine savanna habitat that covered this ecoregion has been degraded or converted for anthropogenic purposes, meaning for human development and growth. So this extreme loss of suitable habitat, coupled with what we're seeing increasingly sudden changes in climate, could lead to extinction for species that are endemic to this hotspot. So analysis of a whole group, or clade, as we call it in the evolutionary biology community, that is endemic to an increasingly endangered habitat, might help give some key information for both species in that clade and habitat conservation at large for a fragile ecosystem. So for my doctoral work, I used the so-called scrub mint clade, of which Dicerandra is a constituent genus, as a model to understand evolutionary and biogeographic changes of these narrow endemics in the North American coastal plain. And I don't know why this is moving by itself like that. I wanted to model future impacts of climate change on these species ranges as well. So the scrub mint clade is comprised of 24 species, restricted almost entirely to the North American coastal plain, and they include Dicerandra, who is the star of the show today, with 11 species, Conradina with 7 species, Phylloblephus and Stachydioma, which are both monotypic, meaning they only have one species in each genera. And then 4 random species of North American Clinopodium. And Clinopodium is something called a junk genus, where a lot of mints that are not easily identifiable to certain other groups have been dumped in by taxonomists in the past. So many species in the scrub mint clade are federally and state listed endangered, the highest concentration of these endangered species in Dicerandra, with 6 listed species, either federally or state listed. Most of their present habitats are mainly in pine savannas and scrubs. These habitats have been destroyed for logging, agricultural, and urban development. So what remains of many of their ranges is largely a patchwork of disconnected habitats, many of which are only on private lands. In terms of the geographic space in which the members of this group are located, the highest species richness is found in 2 spots: in the Apalachicola River Basin in the Florida Panhandle, and along the Lake Wells Ridge in Central Florida. So Dicerandra comprises, like I said, 11 species. There are 6 perennial species and 5 annual species. Annuals have broad distributions to the north. Perennials have narrow distributions in the south. They also differ in that annuals tend to prefer moist, mesic forested sand habitats along riverbeds, while as perennials occur in truly dry, what we call xeric scrub habitats with little in the way of tree cover. Going one by one through Dicerandra, we'll start off with the annuals. And so first off is Dicerandra densiflora, which, as the name implies, has inflorescences or flower spikes that are densely packed with flowers. These flowers are usually lavender to purple in color, with darker spots on the upper and lower lips. This species is found in north central Florida, a little bit to the west and north of the Gainesville area. Next up is Dicerandra linearifolia. It is the most widespread of all of the Dicerandra species. It occurs in sandhill type habitats in the Panhandle, southern Georgia, and southern Alabama. So this species has 2 varieties: variety linearifolia, which has white or pale pink flowers like those on the left, and variety robustior, which has vivid reddish purple flowers like the one on the right. Next up is Dicerandra frumella, first described as a distinct species in 2010 by Robin Huck, who is the original expert of this species, of this genus, and I'll bring her up now and again in future slides. It was originally lumped within Dicerandra linearifolia, but because it has a different chromosome number than Dicerandra linearifolia, it was warranted that it be recognized as a distinct species. It's probably the most diverse when it comes to flower colors. So flower colors are not a good diagnostic for this group because the flowers change from either white to cream colored to pale lavender to, even more rarely, a deep magenta color. Very, very pretty species within Dicerandra. And this one occurs in the Florida Panhandle to the west of Tallahassee and southern Alabama. Then we have Dicerandra odorotissima, which is found, it's the second most widely distributed Dicerandra. It's found in Georgia and southern South Carolina, mostly along the Altamaha River Basin. It has pink lavender flowers that are straight instead of geniculate, or what we'd say bent, like the rest of Dicerandra. And I'll touch upon why this trait might be significant in a later slide. The last of the annual Dicerandra is Dicerandra redfordiana, which has an extraordinarily narrow range. It's very closely related to Dicerandra odorotissima, and recent genetic data that we published in 2019 show that populations of Dicerandra redfordiana were clustered together genetically with nearby Dicerandra odorotissima populations. Regardless, it is listed as an endangered species in the state of Georgia, where it's known only from 2 very, very small populations growing along the banks of the Altamaha River near the Atlantic coast of Georgia. It too, like Odorotissima, has straight corollas. Moving on to the perennial Dicerandra, we'll start off with Dicerandra christmanii. It's a species restricted to 5 populations in the south and southeast of Sebring, Florida, in Highlands County, so south central Florida, where it occurs on very fragmented scrub habitats along the Lake Wills Ridge. It has cream flowers that fade to white with beautiful magenta spotting on the upper lip of the flower, and it has yellow anthers. Then there's Dicerandra cornutissima, which is a very important species, especially to the Florida Native Plant Society membership. It's the furthest north occurring of the perennial Dicerandra species. There are 12 described extant populations, mostly in the Marion County, Florida area, and it faces habitat loss because of development and exotic species competition. There's one large core population that's protected within a managed area, and there's active management of a population of it that occurs along the Marjorie Harris Carr across Florida Greenway. The name cornutissima refers to the very long spur-tipped anthers. As you can tell, these anthers have a very spiky little point to them, very different from the other Dicerandra species. And its flowers are usually a purplish rose color with deep purple markings and a whitish throat. Next up is Dicerandra fructescens, which is endemic to a very limited portion of the Lake Wills Ridge as well in Highlands County, Florida. It has cream flowers that fade to white with beautiful magenta spotting on the upper lip of the flower, almost kind of like an orchid. It's very similar in appearance to Dicerandra christmanii, but can be differentiated from it, which they only occur 10 miles apart from one another. But fructescens has purple pollen on its anthers, while as christmanii has yellow pollen on its anthers. Next up is Dicerandra immaculata, which is known from a handful of sites in St. Lucie and in Indian River counties along the Atlantic coastal ridge in central Florida. It has rose purple flowers with no dots, hence the name immaculata is immaculate. And it has 2 varieties, which can be distinguished from each other based off of leaf width, with Dicerandra immaculata variety salvinarum having slightly wider leaves than variety immaculata. Next up is Dicerandra modesta, which is an endemic of Polk County in central Florida. It was originally described as a subspecies of Dicerandra fructescens because it's very, very similar in appearance, but it was raised to the rank of species after previous evolutionary studies show that it was more closely related to Atlantic coastal ridge species of Dicerandra than to its fellow Lake Wells species. And lastly is Dicerandra thenicola, which occurs along the Atlantic coastal ridge in near Titusville, Florida, in Brevard County. And its flowers are white, fading to pink with purple spots along the lips. As I just mentioned, Dicerandra has been the focus of past evolutionary studies. A previous study in 2006 built this evolutionary tree right here, or phylogeny, using 2 different genes and was able to confirm the existence of an annual and perennial clade. However, relationships amongst these species in those respective clades were not very well resolved. So in order to do the biogeographic and evolutionary analysis that we wanted, we needed to build a better tree. So we did that for the entire scrub mint clade by sequencing over 200 nuclear genes that are found across all species of this group. We then ran dating analyses to determine the age of the different groups. So for our tree, the most recent common ancestor of all of the scrub mints occurred approximately 4 million years ago. And the most recent common ancestor of Dicerandra occurred around 2.4 million years ago, which is denoted right here by this little node. Again, we were able to confirm the existence of both an annual and perennial subclade, and they both appeared on the scene approximately 2 million years ago. So in future slides, the green arrow will refer to the annual clade, and then the purple arrow will refer, the purple one will refer to the annual clade, and the green one will refer to the perennial clade. So now that we have a good evolutionary tree, we can start reconstructing what morphological characteristics of the ancestors of Dicerandra might have had. So we first wanted to reconstruct flower shape to determine if ancestors had a straight or a bent geniculate corolla. We found the straight corolla form as being ancestral for the whole scrub mint group. However, Dicerandra was reconstructed as having a geniculate or bent corolla. Ancestral corolla shape of Dicerandra was originally thought to be straight in previous literature, contrasting with many of the extant members of the group that have geniculate or strongly bent corollas. Unfortunately, there are relatively few pollination studies that have been done on any members of this group, so the relationship between corolla and pollinator type is not yet clear. However, past work on members of perennial Dicerandra species show that these geniculate or bent taxa tend to be visited by certain kinds of bees called halactid bees and bee flies, while many annuals are visited by insects such as the cloudless sulfur butterfly, the Gulf fritillary, and various other kinds of honeybees. None of these pollinator types, however, correlated with a floral form or a shape, indicating that these pollinators are kind of generalists. They're not specifically connected to one species or one floral shape. We then reconstructed the flower number per inflorescence, grading them as either a few flowered or many flowered. The ancestor of the scrub mint clade was reconstructed as having many flowers, or more than 3 flowers per cyme, cyme meaning a flower spike. The multi-flowered flower spike appears in annual Dicerandra as well, and multi-flowered cymes might be a reproductive strategy to invest heavily in flower and subsequently seed, given that most members of this group have pretty poor germination and recruitment. Previous studies by Robin Huck, the original expert of this group, reconstructed the 1 to 3 flower per cyme as plesiomorphic, which essentially means that it is a shared common ancestral characteristic of Dicerandra. But this was not corroborated by our reconstruction of the clade, which found that the ancestral state for Dicerandra was most likely a many-flowered flower spike. Moving on to structural morphology, we wanted to see if these ancestors were either woody or herbaceous, meaning they were soft, not woody. The herbaceous habit was reconstructed as probably the most likely state ancestrally for the scrub mint as a whole, although the woody habit is almost just as likely, as you can tell by this little pie chart right here, with blue being a little bit bigger than red, but being pretty close both one to the other. A woody habit was the inferred ancestral state for Dicerandra in previous literature, despite previous authors describing the woodiness of woody Dicerandra as unrelated to the woodiness found in other species of the scrub mints. And this seems increasingly likely given our morphological and phylogenetic analyses. If this is the case, then the type of woodiness found in perennial Dicerandra is not homologous with the woodiness found in other members of the scrub mint clade and likely evolved independently. It is likely, however, that the woodiness in perennial plants and in the woodiness found in other scrub mint species might be an adaptation to dry xeric habitats that were common across Florida during arid periods of the Pleistocene, which is the last geological era that the Earth just went through, which was characterized by cycles of cold, dry, and warm and wet periods. Then lastly, we reconstructed whether ancestral leaves were wide, leptophilous, or narrow, nanophilous. Leptophilous, or wide leaves, are the most likely ancestral trait for the scrub mints. And leptophilous leaves were historically referred to as the ancestral character for Dicerandra, but this was not shown by our reconstruction, which found that nanophilous leaves were the most likely character state for the most recent common ancestor of Dicerandra, in addition to being the most likely one for perennial Dicerandra as well. The nanophilous leaves found in perennial Dicerandra might be a trait common to dry xeric adapted species, since they are present in species native to gaps within scrub habitats, such as the Lake Wales Ridge and the Atlantic coastal ridges in peninsular Florida, both of which are characterized by their more seasonal rainfall. The leptophilous sister group, which is annual Dicerandra, show characters consistent with shade-adapted species. These species are native to the understory of sandhill habitats in northern areas with more consistent year-round rainfall. So it's possible that these small nanophilous leaves evolved before an ancestor of either Conradina or Dicerandra reached the nascent scrub-dominated Florida peninsula 2 million years ago. So moving on, we wanted to understand the geographic history of the group and where ancestors might have occurred in the past. So we recognized 5 geographic areas in the analysis that were relevant to Dicerandra and scrub mints as a whole. First, the Altamaha River, the Apalachicola River area, the Lake Wales Ridge, the Atlantic Coastal Ridge, and the Cumberland Plateau, which were all based off of distribution patterns that were identified by Alan Weekly in 2001. Area, which is the ancestral area for Dicerandra as a whole, that the ancestral lineage colonized the Lake Wales Ridge, where perennial Dicerandra began to diversify approximately 2 million years ago. This dispersal probably happened over water via stepping stones along what we would call the proto-Lake Wales Ridge, that may have facilitated the subsequent colonization of peninsular Florida, as has been inferred for a lot of other plant groups. So this is similar to the plant ranges that follow the quote-unquote Eastern hypothesis, which states that most scrub plant ancestors were found in Eastern North America, not Western North America, as had been thought by several other scientists. It suggests that the Lake Wales Ridge and associated scrub formed during the glacial cycling of the Pleistocene, which spans from about 2.5 million years ago to about 10,000 years ago. So we also detected an upward diversification rate shift, which essentially means that more species started popping up during this period of time. And it coincides timeline-wise with the beginning of the Pleistocene and this cyclical freeze-thaw that enhanced the expansion of the scrubby, semi-arid environments in southeastern North America. Since almost all species related to scrub mints and Dicerandra prefer open xeric habitats, and since the greatest diversity of Dicerandra and scrub mints is found in these dry, scrubby sandhill environments, we hypothesize that the shift to increasing aridity and seasonality in the North American coastal plain could have given scrub mints and Dicerandra an advantage over the competition in new habitats, such as the Lake Wales Ridge, and also in older but increasingly dry habitats like the sandhills around the Apalachicola. When reconstructing ancestral ranges to see what they might have looked like, we found similar patterns to our biogeographic analyses, that the putative range for the ancestor of Dicerandra during peak glacial periods was further south and narrow than that during the interglacial, which was further north and either in the peninsula or in the Piedmont, with the glacial maxima distribution having a a very well-recognized hook-shaped distribution along the southern Florida and northern Gulf Coast, as has been found for other plant species that occur in the North American coastal plain. So because of the different distribution patterns seen in extant annual Dicerandra versus perennial Dicerandra, I was curious what these ancestral ranges might have looked like across glacial and interglacial periods of the Pleistocene. So we were able to reconstruct the ancestral range of the ancestor of annual Dicerandra as native to the Apalachicola and Panhandle and northern peninsular Florida area of Florida during warm interglacial periods, and then the Lake Wales Ridge, Atlantic coastal ridges, and peninsular Florida during the cold glacial periods. And very similar periods were found for the ancestor of perennial Dicerandra, with a little bit more of a peninsular bias during the warm periods or interglacial periods of the Pleistocene. Moving on to endemism analyses, we use these analyses to determine hotspots of endemism for the group. On the left are what we call phylogenetic endemism, or essentially evolutionary endemism, based off of the tree that I previously showed and locality data where these species currently exist. The red cell values, which are mostly over, there it goes again, which are mostly over the Apalachicola area and southern areas of the Lake Wales Ridge, show that there's higher endemism than expected. And blue areas show there's significantly lower endemism than expected. We then use this analysis to then pick up on centers of paleoendemism in blue on the left and neoendemism in red on the right. And on the the centers of endemism is all on the right. So the red centers, the red shows centers of neoendemism and the blue shows centers of paleoendemism. So we were able to uncover areas of paleoendemism, unsurprisingly, in Apalachicola, which has been described as a museum of biodiversity by many biologists. And we were able to find areas of neoendemism along the Atlantic coastal ridge, which has been characterized as a cradle, meaning a lot of new species show up on the Atlantic coastal ridge because of its much younger age in the Apalachicola River ravine area. So now moving on to the future of these species and how that might affect conservation concerns. So we use something called ecological niche modeling to offer another perspective for conservation decision-making for scrub mints, thus helping land use decision makers determine which specific species are at highest risk of having habitat loss or extinction. This helps not only with land conservation decisions, but also helps with seed conservation and live plant collections that can help preserve genetic diversity within species that are otherwise condemned to extinction. Here it goes again. Of the 12 species of scrub mints that exclusively occur in the Florida Peninsula, 8 are expected to lose habitat under a future climate change scenario, and 4 are expected to experience an increase in total amount of habitat. So the 3 species of Dicerandra that are predicted to have the greatest increase in geographic range are Dicerandra fumella, Dicerandra densiflora, and surprisingly Dicerandra chrismanii, which has a very narrow range. As you can tell, these species vary widely in their present distribution sizes, ranging from the narrow endemics like chrismanii to more widely distributed species like fumella. Of the species that in most dire risk of losing all suitable habitat in their native ranges, 2 are native to the Lake Wales Ridge, and of those, Dicerandra modesta is projected to be the worst off, with approximately 0 kilometers squared of suitable habitat remaining by 2070. It's also one of the few perennial Dicerandra not currently represented in botanical garden collections and is not currently federally listed. In the wild currently, there's only 1 population of Dicerandra modesta on public lands and possibly only 1 small population remaining on private lands. Dicerandra thenicola is another of the most at-risk Dicerandra species with only 30 known extant populations and a projected range collapse from 417 kilometers squared to 194 kilometers squared. Sorry. This species, and as Modesta and Cornutissima, as I'll mention now, are particularly sensitive to disturbance and shading. So extra efforts are needed to ensure that these existing protected sites are being maintained properly. And lastly, Dicerandra cornutissima is a close relative of Dicerandra modesta, is also at great risk of losing almost all of its suitable habitat by 2070, with a potential reduction of suitable habitat from 611 kilometers squared presently to only 59 kilometers squared by 2070. And so in prioritizing areas for conservation policies and protection, species richness is routinely the accepted measure. However, understanding evolutionary patterns in conjunction with ecological modeling of the future is of equal importance when determining regions in need of preservation and restoration. It can be seen from these results that cells with low numbers of species from the scrub mints, results of the cells from our endemism analyses, with low numbers of species from the scrub mints can still contain a significant amount of endemism, while also face grave danger from the risk presented by climate change. Florida has an extensive state park and public land system, and identifying the significant areas that lie outside of these reserves is an effective way of prioritizing conservation efforts in the future. So in the comparison between the identified endemism hotspots that are over here on the upper right-hand corner and the existing public lands shows mixed coverage. So while paleo endemism hotspots of the Apalachicola, Florida Panhandle are protected by federal, state, and non-government organization lands, many of the significant endemism hotspots in the Atlantic coastal ridge are protected by local lands or joint ownership. So essentially conservation areas that can be utilized for natural resources like logging. So these areas contain significant endemism, and an emphasis should be placed on elevating their level of protection, in addition to identifying remaining pockets of coastal scrub habitat that are outside of any protected land, currently protected lands, and labeling those as prioritizing those for conservation management. As you might know, Florida Native Plant Society was given funds by Duke Energy to monitor the remaining populations and remediate sites for Dicerandra modesta and Dicerandra cornutissima. This, in addition to including these species in seed banks and living collections at botanical gardens, are crucial to future safeguarding of these critically endangered rare species. So the creation of protected areas is an inherently political process, and conservation concerning threatened species and endemism has historically not been the primary driver of the creation of protected areas. So ultimately, this has left some threatened species like Dicerandra cornutissima, with only 5 of its 12 populations included in any protected area, public or private, as new reserves in North America are usually located in places with high species richness, while not taking into account the protection of endangered species and local biodiversity. Funding allocation to conservation stakeholders like Florida Native Plant Society is an important part of protecting biodiversity, but its benefits might be augmented further by using a structured, systematic approach to conservation planning. So like this Bok Tower Gardens shown here currently has 8 scrub mint species in its national collection, where threatened and endangered species are seed banked and cultivated to help preserve genetic diversity within species. Efforts like these should be augmented to make sure all threatened species are included in such collections. Furthermore, both private and public stakeholders should dedicate more resources to sampling these populations of at-risk Dicerandra and scrub mint species to check for individual numbers, habitat condition, and other measures. Acquisition and proper management of these remaining unprotected scrub habitats will also be crucial to preserving remaining populations and to allow for future reintroduction from areas where species were formerly eliminated. So to briefly touch upon the general conclusions, first, our morphology analyses reveal that the ancestor of the scrub mints and of Dicerandra were likely well adapted to the drier climate of Florida during the Pleistocene. The ancestral area of scrub mints was somewhere in the Florida Panhandle Apalachicola River Basin, as well as the ancestral area of Dicerandra. There was a diversification event with the start of aridification during the Pleistocene. Ancestral ranges support these biogeographic findings. We found endemism hotspots in the Apalachicola River area and along the Atlantic coastal ridge, signaling areas where biodiversity-based land conservation should be focused. And 63% of Dicerandra species would occupy smaller geographic ranges in the future. The loss of this habitat is most pronounced in peninsular species in general, but is also found in species that are found further north. And with that, I would like to thank all of my funding sources, IDIG-Bio, National Science Foundation, University of Florida, especially Florida Native Plant Society. I'd like to thank my lab for all of their help kind of coming to all these conclusions and helping me with data analyses and things like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. This is, I mean, basically my favorite kind of research, research that literally informs conservation directly that we can take action on immediately.
Right.
Yeah.
It's I do want to specify that even though ecological niche models do show a pretty dire future for both Dicerandra modesta and Dicerandra cornutissima, these models only take into consideration what we call abiotic factors, so climate and soil. It doesn't take into consideration interactions with other plants, with other pollinators, with fungi that might live on the surface of the leaves that help it, persist in areas that are pretty difficult. But what it does tell us is that, without a doubt, seems especially that Dicerandra modesta, Thenicola, and cornutissima, left to their own devices, are going to face a pretty dark future, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and we will talk a lot more about our work on those species and my experience with those monitoring those mints.
Yeah, what Florida Native Plant Society has done monitoring and doing demographic studies is literally the cornerstone of any sort of conservation program, right? So I'm just a small little cog in the greater realization of what species need to be flagged for the most intensive conservation efforts.
Sorry, guys, getting over a cold. It's just so insane, Modesta, right? 0 square kilometers available, and you can go there and you walk into the site, and you can literally see all of the Modesta habitat. You can see all of the Modesta habitat remaining, with the current populations. You can just see it with your eyes.
Right. And these models don't take into consideration urban development. So that's another consideration, right? With the massive expansion of Central Florida, of the I-4 corridor, of US 27 corridor even, and occasionally there's propositions to build highways through that area as well. It's something that definitely needs to be taken into consideration, right? Especially if it's not just Dicerandra, there's countless other species that maybe haven't had these studies done that face a very similar future if they're not given the proper resources and care.
And that population, living primarily in the power line corridor there, got the Sable Trail pipeline put through it and basically decimated that population. I mean, this year monitoring, reproduction was not great. I mean, I know there's boom and bust years, but the Natal grass and all that disturbance, and there was a whole area where they put different kind of fill in, and I mean, the one population, I mean, the planning for these plants, it's just not there.
Right.
It's insane.
And the issue is, so a lot of people talk about seed bank, and what that means is essentially there's a plant, it releases its seeds, the seeds go into the soil, they don't necessarily germinate, but they persist there in case in the future some sort of event happens, like a fire or something like that. And these plants are able to spring back and reestablish their populations. Problem with very heavy mechanical disturbances, that seed bank is destroyed. Dicerandra seeds are notoriously difficult to germinate in the first place, and don't disperse very far from the mother plant because there's really no dispersal mechanism for them. And so it's not putting like a pipeline through an area. If you don't seed collect, if you don't manually move those populations are gone for good. So lots of different considerations to keep in mind when saving populations of species, and trying to at least create a reservoir of genetic diversity, because we can have one member of a species left, right? And we can just take cuttings of that member and propagate them ad infinitum. That's not a species, that's an individual. And species do best when species have genetic diversity. And with every population that goes away, there's less genetic diversity, there's more inbreeding. These plants get progressively weaker and weaker and weaker.
Yeah, and with Dicerandra too, when we're talking about ex situ collections, you have to be careful because even though they speciated 2 million years ago, these things
Yeah,
hybridize like
they
crazy.
hybridize. Yes, they do. And that's something I didn't touch upon on the presentation today, but hybridization is rampant throughout the ancestors of perennial Dicerandra and annual Dicerandra. And there's some evidence that way back then there might have been the ancestor of perennial Dicerandra might have hybridized with the ancestor of annual Dicerandra. So that's something that we're learning more and more, not just with Dicerandra, but across all plant groups, is that hybridization is an incredibly important driver of diversity. But at the same time, we also have to keep in mind that we don't know the effect that hybridization might have on some of these populations, because there's some kinds of hybridization lead to hybrid depression, essentially, where the hybrid plant resulting from the cross of these two species might actually be weaker than either of its two parents. So those are the things that we have to keep in mind, right? These plants are, especially the Lake Wales Ridge and the Atlantic Coastal Ridge endemics, were essentially on their own islands just a few 100,000 years ago. And they had a strong physical boundary separating them, the ocean, right? Especially during periods when the glaciers were all gone and there's a relatively warm period. So it's important to keep in mind that nowadays, like what we see, these very fragmented, narrow ranges are a product of that.
Yeah, that's super cool to think about. Okay, so back early on, I think we were talking about annual
Mhm.
Dicerandras. Shiala Naranjo asks, for the species that has a different color, is the color related to temperature?
No. And we actually, based off of literature, there's really no reason why one color might pop up in a population over another. It seems that all Dicerandra kind of seem to be on a gradient between white to cream colored to pink lavender to magenta, right? These might just be manifestations of what we call phenotypic plasticity. There hasn't been any sort of genetic studies with regards to why a certain flower color arises in a population or in a species. Temperature doesn't seem to be a motivator, and neither does pollinator type. These plants seem to be pretty good at being pollinated by what we call generalists, meaning insects that can just buzz into one flower, buzz to another. They don't really mind. There's not one specific species that is attached to any of these Dicerandra species. So yeah, a lot of these traits are just kind of like, we need more ecological work, to really kind of tease apart how some of these traits might relate to ecological functions.
Mm-hmm.
I know Eric Menges and and people down at Archibald have dedicated their life work to essentially finding out about Dicerandra ecology. So props to them.
Yeah, yeah, some great
Yeah.
reading coming out of them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mary Kime and Randy Snyder ask, are the seeds eaten by animals that would disperse some of them?
Nope. So the funny thing is, the only described dispersal mechanism for Dicerandra seeds is they look a lot like I don't know if anyone's ever seen basil seeds. Like they're come out of a little pouch, and they have their little hard black seeds that have mucilaginous glands on the sides of them. And so thinking about why would a seed need mucus on its sides, and it turns out that it seems that during heavy rainfall events, this is especially the case for perennial Dicerandra seeds. These seeds will, when they get wet during a heavy rainfall, the mucilaginousness will help them go down in small little currents or little streams that might pop up in a scrub sand habitat, and help them move a few meters away from their the adult plant. But I don't think they've ever recorded any sort of dispersal greater than 2 meters. So they're kind of lazy when it comes to dispersing. No animal dispersal. They're just waiting on heavy rainfall and for those seeds to pop off at the right time for them to kind of like go along in little wet streams that might show up. Not really streams even. They're little, like little puddles
Yeah,
essentially.
like a moving puddle. Yeah.
A moving puddle, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I'll have photos on during my presentation, but basically
Yeah,
we have the big mamas, which sometimes depending on the habitat quality, that big
yeah,
mama might be yay big or she might
yeah,
be like a Volkswagen.
exactly.
But then all the babies are basically like within 2 feet.
Right.
Just a bunch of
Not that far.
reproduction, look great, and then she dies, and it's a skeleton.
Exactly, a skeleton parent and then a whole bunch of babies around it. Yep.
Yeah.
And they don't really reproduce clonally. They don't the perennial Dicerandra are interesting because they have, even though they're woody, the flowers are born on herbaceous stems. So it's essentially kind of like this in between woody and herbaceous. So while as like a conradina is always woody and doesn't have this sort of like herbaceous stem with flowers that comes off from the base, the perennial Dicerandra is like, I'm going to do both. I'm going to have woody leaves and woody branches that persist, but I'm going to put all of my flowers on these softer stems,
Mm-hmm.
which is really interesting as well.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
We've seen plants split in the center and then
Yeah.
suspected, but obviously you can't know for sure, but maybe some rooting depending on the
Right.
site.
They're notoriously weak wooded. I've tried growing the annual members and the unprotected species of Conradina, and all the members of the group have very weak wood where they do tend to split down the middle. And if the split does happen and during a wet enough period and in enough close proximity to the soil, then rooting can happen. Yeah, but it's not easy.
No, it's not like
No,
completely prevalent.
it's
It's like,
not
ooh,
common.
I wonder
Yeah,
if that's a new plant because we have to differentiate between the new plants, and I'll talk all about this, but member
right,
tag, and so we're like, is that the same plant? Is it a different plant? You dig around in the soil.
right.
Yeah. Danny Young pops in. You did answer Dicer. What does Dicerandra mean? But he wants to specify. Does that mean two sets of anthers?
Um, Interesting. No, it's one anther that essentially buds off early in development. So it's one anther, and then right before the flower opens and boop, pops out.
Yeah, so it's got like a little horn
So it's got a
situation.
little horn. Yep.
Yeah. And that's what
Which in Conradina, I believe it's just one. And there might be like a little bit of bifurcation in some species, but it's not like a true horn like it is in Dicerandra.
and like in Dicerandra cornatissima, long spurred bulb, those are the spurs, right?
Yeah, the
And they're like,
spurs, right?
whoa, I mean, you can really see them.
Very long.
Yeah.
And that, anthers are essentially, their job is to get pollen on a pollinator. And cornatissima having especially long anthers, spurred anthers is pretty interesting. But again, I haven't found or read any pollination ecology work on cornatissima, although it'd be really interesting to see more, especially because of the exaggerated nature of those
Right.
spurs.
So I've seen a lot of those big progressive bee flies out there, just
Mm-hmm.
and you're like, whoa.
Yeah, you hear them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In
Yeah,
addition to
yeah.
your bumblebees and stuff, but I've seen on cornatissima, way more of those
Oh,
progressive
way
bee
more.
flies.
Yeah. Well, it's the more pollen. Well, bigger host. There's more pollen, more surface area. Whoop, there you go. Pretty easy ecological hypothesis there.
All right, so that is all the questions in the chat. I give people a little bit of time, but man, thank you so much for working on this and all of your research and for presenting to us today.
Thank you. No, thank you so much again for having me. It's really awesome to be able to present to an organization and members that really care about safeguarding Florida's native plant diversity, which is, I would say, at least in the top 5 biodiverse states for vascular plants. And with the fact that our population is growing so quickly and we have so many snowbirds and other people moving down here permanently, it's going to be really important that everyone at least comes to an appreciation of our plant diversity, of these beautiful plants, for instance, that are very much at risk of being wiped out, whether it be because of climate change or human development. And I think that first step to conservation is appreciation. And so thank you for giving me a chance to kind of talk about why I appreciate these plants. And I hope everybody got something out of it as well.
Yes, and I will take that moment to pitch membership to the Florida Native Plant Society. We are a membership-based organization. We have 34 chapters throughout the state. You probably have a little group to associate with and go learn about native plants with. This is a public lunch and learn, so you could be a member of the public on here. So I am just popping the membership link on the chat. You can also buy someone a membership too if you think, hey, this person needs to appreciate native plants more. They should learn about Dicerandra.
Yeah. Agreed.
And walk through it one day and then you'll understand why it's so awesome, because it smells great.
Yeah, I didn't mention anything about smells, but oh man, you have everything from eucalyptus to menthol to mint to cinnamon to lemon balm, everything. I've smelled so many, and you can smell them on a warm day, down breeze. You can smell them before even seeing them. And there's been some phytochemical work on those compounds as well, and a whole bunch of them have antimicrobial properties. I think 2 different compounds were described for the first time from Dicerandra species that had antimicrobial properties. So even beyond just the role that they play in ecology, in a community of plants, they're also really cool chemically and aesthetically. So there's more than one reason to really like Dicerandra.
Awesome. Well, on that note, I will let everybody go. Enjoy their Friday, and thank you again.
Yeah. Happy Friday, everyone.